Hi guys, Luke Johnson here again. We've got Joseph Agu, my good friend, and Brad Schoenfeld today. So, Joe, if you want to give a little introduction of yourself for the guys to get to know you.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm a nutritionist for the English Institute of Sport, working with British athletics. Also a PhD student looking at nutrition interventions for the sprinter. And in my spare time, I run my own nutrition consultancy business out of josephagu.com. Work with anyone from typical gym goers through to elite athletes across a range of sports. So.
Excellent. And Brad, for those which may not know you, if you could give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that makes me unique is that I have a blend of both practical experience as well as being an educator. So I own my own private training facility for about 18 years. I sold it a couple of years ago, but I work with a lot of physique athletes. And I work with everyone, everyone from your typical housewife to your stockbroker and everything in between. But I specialize in working with a lot of elite level physique athletes, bodybuilders, figure competitors, etc., both at the professional and at the high level amateur level. I'm currently on the faculty at Lehman College in the exercise science program. I'm a lecturer in exercise science. I also am the director of the Human Performance Lab there. Published over 40 peer-reviewed articles, and really my focus is on muscle hypertrophy specifically, as was mentioned, and it's kind of bringing both the science together with the art, bridging the gap between science and art in helping people optimize their hypertrophic potential.
Excellent answer. Right, so we start with some questions. So these questions are from people off social media and also the guys which are signed up to Brad's Early Birds special. And we'll talk about Brad coming over in a little bit. So starting off, Brad, what are your views on low load training for hypertrophy? Is there enough evidence, do you feel, that it would be more beneficial over traditional hypertrophy methods?
Yeah, I actually wrote a paper on that, which was published in the journal Sports Medicine. I had a print about a month or so ago. Very interesting topic, and it's the research is still emerging as opposed to what had been generally accepted even just a few years ago. We now know that training at pretty low loads, upwards of 30 to 40% at least, can promote a substantial increase in muscle hypertrophy. Now, that's just on the surface. So yes, can you gain muscle on that type of routine? Yes. Now the question really becomes, can you gain, is it comparable to what you gain through moderate to higher load training? And the jury is still out on that. There is some evidence that you can, some evidence that you can't. And also, really, there's no evidence or there's no research that's been conducted in experienced lifters. So really everything that we know to this point is based upon the untrained population. So there's just a lot of things we still need to know here. And by the way, so what I would say is that there's good evidence that you should be incorporating low load training into a routine. I have a paper that's will be coming out fairly shortly in the Strength and Conditioning Journal of the NSCA that discusses this. And what is interesting, if you look within the research, there's a suggestion that the lower load training will help to optimize type 1 fiber hypertrophy, which, as we know, are the endurance-based fibers, whereas higher load training, moderate to higher load, seems to do more in the type 2 fibers. So by incorporating at least some low load training, regardless of your experience level, should have a positive effect on overall hypertrophy.
Excellent. Cheers, Brad.
Great. So yeah, I'll ask the next question. So
just got one more bit, Joe, sorry. There's a second part to that question.
Oh, okay.
So Brad, you sort of touched on it there. How would you apply low load training for different levels and experienced trainees? So as you said, there's not much evidence in terms of elite lifters or those which are, as we deem as trained individuals. So how would you vary it between beginners to advanced lifters, just for the practical?
Well, I wouldn't even look at it in that context. I would look at it that low load training can and should play a part in a training routine if your goal is hypertrophy. Now, obviously, just take a step back, that any training program is goal specific, the principle of specificity. So if you are let's say, an athlete that needs a lot of fast twitch muscle fiber development, I would not really be focusing. That would not be my focus. But for hypertrophy, where we're looking, certainly there's good evidence that that increasing the muscle protein accretion in all the fibers has a beneficial effect on total, on what the outward appearance is from an aesthetic standpoint, certainly. I recommend incorporating it into a routine if your goal is optimal hypertrophy. And there's many different ways that can be done. One of the ways I like to do, I have a book out called The Max Muscle Plan, and I'm a big proponent of periodizing a program in some way. And if your goal is to look good at a certain point in time, in what I call a modified linear type program, you'd have a cycle anywhere between generally I like to use a 4-week cycle where low load training is integrated in, and that not only does it help to optimize type 1 fiber hypertrophy, but it also helps to raise your lactate threshold. And thus, by doing that, you end up being able to have greater or train at a higher level of your RM in moderate rep training. So what we often see is that in moderate rep training, let's say you have a 90-second rest in between sets, you'll go from your 10 RM, in your first set will drop down to a 6 RM roughly, in terms you only be able to get 6 reps at your 10 RM. By training at this higher rep range, it helps to raise your lactate threshold and will allow you to consistently get closer to your RM throughout your moderate rep training.
Excellent. Cheers, Brad. Joe, over to you.
Okay, so when and how do you think blood flow restriction training should be used, and for which population do you think it's best suited to?
Well, this blood flow restricted training is really, again, another emerging technique that science is showing to be potentially very beneficial. Now, who should use it? Well, a wide range of subjects. First of all, the elderly can use it, assuming they're healthy and don't have any vascular issues. It's because you are able to use a very low load. So blood flow restricted training, for those who don't know, is using a cuff, and you can use either the cuffs used in research are very expensive, so you can use basic knee wraps. That's what I use when I integrate the technique, and you tie it off at the proximal end. So for upper arm training, for arm training, you'll tie it off at the proximal end, so all the way at the upper portion of the arm. For leg training, you'll do it at the upper thigh near the groin. And you then perform repetitions at about 20 to 30% of your 1 RM to fatigue. And the basic science, to simplify it, is that it creates metabolic stress during training. That metabolic stress has been shown to mediate various hypertrophic responses within the body. And so who can use it? Like I said, elderly people. It certainly can be very effective for elderly who can't load themselves. If you put a 70% RM load on some elderly people, it might overstress their joints, especially arthritis can be an issue there. But for your person who is looking to optimize hypertrophy, it's a really nice adjunct to traditional training, and that's the way I use it in my programs and those when I consult with people often. So my general way or approach to it is to do your multi-joint moves first, and then use it as a finishing type movement on a single joint exercise. So let's say you're doing a leg routine that constitutes squats, leg presses, and leg extensions. Your squats and leg presses are done in traditional fashion, let's say in a hypertrophy range of 6 to 12 reps, whatever that may be. And then your BFR would be done on the leg extension at the end. So you might do 3 to 4 sets at a low load. And you take very minimal rest between sets as well. So about 30 seconds rest. So you really jack up the metabolic stress, and thus you really get a tremendous pump from that type of exercise.
Cool.
Good.
Excellent. Back to me, Brad. what are your thoughts on time under tension for hypertrophy, and what would you suggest as parameters for rep speed?
Yeah, I mean, certainly time under tension is going to be an important factor. If you're asking, is anyone qualified or is research at all qualified what an optimal time under tension is? No. And we're even not sure. Just one of the things my dissertation work is going to look for is, not to get too much into this, because I will have, by the way, for our London conference, some good data, which will be really cool from this. But until the study is complete, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag too much. But what I'll say is that what I'm looking at is, does a lower repetition on a volume equated basis, does lower repetition training, so powerlifting style training, have comparable or better results or worse results than hypertrophy type training, which is moderate reps? And if you're volume equating it, so the time under tension will be approximately, or certainly the loading will, and you can have roughly equal time under tension there too. Does that equate, or do you need an actual, does it have to be consecutive time under tension? We don't know, and that is really something that is going to be an interesting thing that future research hopefully looks at. And what was the second part of that question?
And in terms of the speed of the repetition, so I suppose that would be dictated by the load you're lifting.
There's been very little research on speed. My general approach to now, the one thing that is pretty clear from the literature is that training at very slow speeds is not optimal. Mm-hmm. So you're super slow type training, but there's been all sorts of other very equivocal research on whether 3 seconds up, 3 seconds down. My general approach is an explosive repetition on the way up, or controlled explosive repetition. So you pretty much train, you're going to push the weight up quickly on the concentric, and then allow about 2 seconds, 1 to 2 seconds or so on the negative. Could it be 3 seconds? Yes. But the idea would be to, the most important thing on the eccentric is lowering it under control. Mm-hmm. So I do see some people that are opting for hypertrophy that basically just let the weight fall down, and there's no control on that aspect. And thus they're really missing out on the eccentric component, which does have effects over and above what concentric. There actually has been some real interesting research showing that the eccentric reps and concentric reps have somewhat different, or result in somewhat different muscular adaptations. So it's important to have both.
Excellent. Cheers, Brad.
So the next question, what are your views on undulated periodization and its benefits? Is it a useful method to use when your goal is muscular hypertrophy?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of periodization in general, and there's all different ways that periodization can be approached. One way is not necessarily better than another. Part of it comes down to what you're looking to accomplish. So if you're, at least in my opinion, if your goal is to, let's say, peak for a competition, if you're a bodybuilder, I prefer more of what I call a modified undulating, a modified linear type approach, which has some aspects of undulating periodization intertwined within it, but it focuses on different mesocycles that take you to your goal. Whereas if your goal is more just overall looking for multiple factors where hypertrophy is within that, and undulating periodization often can work better, particularly if you're an athlete. If hypertrophy is part of your goal as an athlete, let's say as a football player, or I should say American football, because soccer.
Two different things.
Here we know football is soccer, not what you guys do. But anyway, but for a goal where you're really looking to maximize hypertrophy from a sporting perspective, and playing in multiple games over the course of time, undulating periodization often is a better approach in that context.
Excellent. Right, another periodization question. So just moving on from that, how can one apply progression and periodization to a circuit style training? So example being the popularity of CrossFit, and how trainers would apply scientific training methodology to a program for someone using CrossFit.
Yeah, that's a real interesting question. I'm asked about CrossFit a lot, and the basic principle behind CrossFit, there's certainly nothing wrong with it. It can be an effective way to train if your goal is a general type of fitness. So I think the CrossFit type of model can be employed fairly well I said, oh, it can be a very viable option if you just want to get good in a lot of different things, kind of general fitness levels, muscular fitness. The issue is in the application, is kind of you're intimating, and it's just many of the people who are carrying out CrossFit do it, number one, with no focus on the form involved. There is no focus on deloading, so it's balls to the wall training every time you're training. There is very little variety. It's mostly sagittal plane movement. So there's just a lot of real issues with the way that the general, that most people, or many people, I should say, are carrying out CrossFit type training. Now, how can periodization be applied? In the way it is with anything. So really you want to, number one, structure deload periods. And that's really one of the most important things about periodization. What periodization looks to do is it looks to optimize your results without going into a non-functional overreaching or an overtrained type state. So it looks to keep the progress going without having the plateaus that are often experienced. And that, number one, you've got to deload, so you have to have periods where you are not training as hard, or else you're going to get burnout from it. You need to employ a variety of movements over the course of a given cycle, whereas CrossFit often, like I said, is very sagittally plane focused. I recently did a study on horizontal extension, so the rear pec fly, where you do this in a pec machine. The worst performer by far and away was CrossFitter, because he just never performs exercises in that plane. So really, it's just a combination of varying your movements. Periodization is planned manipulation of training variables, and that's something that is missing in that style of training.
Cool.
Awesome.
I just had to hang up a phone here.
If it's important, I'll ring back 10 times. Okay. Joe,
okay, so
over to
the
you.
next question.
You got the next few, Joe.
Yeah.
By the way,
there's quite a few parts of that one. So what are your views on sarcoplasmic hypertrophy programs when people use them on a low carbohydrate diet?
Okay. Now, in understanding the question, I would never recommend training specifically for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Is something that will happen as a byproduct of training. Yeah. The primary sarcoplasmic fractions, let's say in a moderate, so the basic difference between sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, or the accretion of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, would be, let's say, a very low rep routine, so a powerlifting style routine, where you're going to be relying on the phosphagen system and thus not have a lot of glycogen stored. So what you really, the moderate to higher rep range will increase some sarcoplasmic aspects from is greater glycogen storage. It's an adaptive process that by training in a glycolytic environment, mostly with the glycolytic energy system, the body is going to adapt in a way that it promotes greater glycogen storage. And glycogen, as we know, attracts roughly 3 grams of water per gram of glycogen. So you'll get greater intramuscular water. I wouldn't say, hey, I'm going to train for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Like I said, it would be a byproduct. So,
yeah.
And whether it's low carb or high carb, so really now, actually, in thinking about the question, I guess then, so certainly, I think really the greater question there, if it's about training low carb, that can be an issue from a anabolic standpoint. So if you're, in my general recommendation is, if you want to maximize hypertrophy, low carb is not the way to go. And really there's 2 primary reasons. Number one, 80% of a bodybuilding style training routine is the energy is derived from glycogen. So studies have pretty clearly shown this. So if you are depleted, glycogen depleted, then you're going to have a tough time pushing through your routine, and your performance is going to suffer. And just as importantly, from an anabolic standpoint, glycogen has been shown to be highly anabolic in terms of promoting anabolism, and that when glycogen levels are low, it actually signals a what's called AMPK, so a kinase called AMPK, which is a catabolic kinase, and it actually has the effect of impairing muscle development. So low glycogen stores is not a recipe for muscle hypertrophy.
Okay. There was a follow-up to that question, but yeah, you've covered that in your thorough response. So thanks for that. So Luke, over to you.
Cool. With your experience or any research you've seen, would female subjects, would there be any differences that you would prescribe in terms of their training, in terms of optimizing muscle hypertrophy? So my example would be whether you find they respond better to more mechanical tension rather than sort of looking at a metabolic stress as you stated beforehand.
Yeah, no, and as a matter of fact, women and men have very similar responses. Now, obviously, the magnitude of the response is going to be greater in males, but as far as training women differently, no, it really comes down to the individual. Now, some people are going to be more responsive to hypertrophy than others, but I do not train men or women. If their goal is to maximize hypertrophy, the training really would be virtually identical.
Cool. Would you take into account previous training? So you tend to find especially female clients, when working with female clients, they do a load of body pump classes where they're doing really low weights and just doing about 300 reps on bicep curl on the barbell. Would you find taking on a female client that you'd probably, because they're trained in that in terms of their previous training, would you therefore go for more sort of higher weights, more mechanical tension, taking that into account?
Well, I mean, the basic progression that I would do would be strength, and then I mean, it wouldn't differ really, because I would start them off with a strength routine, but generally I start off males with that too, because most males, or certainly many males looking for bodybuilding, do not train with heavier weights either, and I'd want to get them first stronger, which is going to allow for heavier weights in a hypertrophy cycle. So not really. Again, everyone's an individual, and I would take into account really what's been done. They might need, women in the context that you're talking about, might need more of a break-in period per se for heavier weight training. So that might be a concern. But again, really, it's more of the individual rather than the gender itself.
Excellent. Okay, last few questions. So you mentioned deloading before. If you could give us some of your views on deloading, how you would incorporate that into someone's training, and in terms of what parameters would you change in terms of adjusting volume or intensity?
Yeah, great question. Deloading, for those who don't know, is basically a reduction in training volume and or intensity, and it's for the purpose of allowing greater restoration and recuperation. So the thought that you can just train balls to the wall every time you work out is decidedly counterproductive, because at some point you're going to become overtrained. I was actually just talking about this earlier today with bodybuilders John Meadows and Ben Pekulski, and it's interesting. Look, a lot of things is John Meadows was saying that he's had bodybuilders that he's worked with that can go for half a year, 6 months, and just keep training. And you have to remember that gear is going to enter into it. If you read between the lines there, and other things, supplemental things that you're taking might can mitigate that. But generally speaking, certainly for people who are natural, my general approach is for every 3 weeks of our training, you have a week of deload. Now that can be varied. That's just a general template that I use. So can someone go 5 or 6 weeks? Yeah, you have to kind of get to know the person. But we have to get out of our heads that by taking a week of less volume and intensity is going to have a negative effect as oh my God, I'm going to lose everything I have. That doesn't happen. Really is, in my experience, certainly the research hasn't looked at this well enough, but I can tell you from training literally several thousand people over the course of my career that you tend to see, when you structure these deloads, you tend to see greater less of ebbs and flows. So you tend to see more of a linear progress than you do if you just keep training. And I've tried to be very scientific about this when I've carried this out. Now, the specifics, I like to reduce both volume and intensity. Now, I reduce volume by reducing frequency of training. So if someone is training, let's say, 5 days a week during a period they're going down to 2 or 3 for that one deload week. So I would, and that depends on the level of experience. There's multiple factors that I would consider there, and you have to take your own considerations into account. So I reduce the frequency, so I keep the volume in the session the same, but I reduce the number of times they're training in a week, which reduces the overall weekly volume. And I also reduce the intensity of effort by which they train, so they're not pushing to failure as much. I'll make the weights lighter, and I don't allow them to go to failure on the set, so they stop short of failure. And it's a subjective, intuitive process that you have to do if you're training a client. You have to get to know the client well enough, get feedback from them, and if you're doing it with yourself, you have to be honest with yourself and try to make sure you don't overdo it and resist. One thing I want to really emphasize: you need to resist the urge to say, "Oh, if I'm not training really hard, then it's not worth training at all." That's just an ego-driven approach that ultimately will have negative effects.
Cheers.
Great. So when starting to work with a new client, what interview process do you conduct with them? Well, especially with clients that are unclear of the goals.
Yeah, I do an extensive interview process before training anyone. I think anyone who's training anyone has to do that. And the first thing I'm going to do is extensive medical history. I want to know if they had any injuries, certainly if there's any medical related issues they're having that might interfere with training, drugs they're taking, both prescription and or recreational and or performance enhancing. That's very important. From performance enhancing, I've certainly dealt with enough, and that will affect recuperative abilities and other things. And then you want to know their goals. You want to get into, number one, their lifestyle. So what are they doing for a living? Are they a hard laborer, or are they an office worker? That's going to have effects on things like overtraining. If you're out there breaking stone as a mason, you're going to your energy resources are going to be sapped a lot more quickly than someone who's working in an office for the most part. So there's a lot of things going on, and then really qualifying goals to me is just so important. You need to know their previous training experience, what they've done, the specifics. I can tell you that I've worked with so many people who tell me how, I've been training for 7, 8, 9 years, and their idea of training, they certainly were training, but when you actually get them into the gym, they are, to say the least, they do not understand what training really hard is about.
Yeah, that's what I tend to say with clients. I say, how long have you been training for? And they say maybe 6 years. And I say, how long have you properly been training for? It's normally, 2 years.
If that, yeah.
Yeah.
In many cases.
Okay, excellent. Right, last question. What do you feel is needed with future research regarding hypertrophy and strength training? And I know you're got your hands in plenty of research and reviews. You're always sort of publishing something every week or two. I'm like, another one.
I would say everything is needed, first of all. But to me, my particular focus is on what happens in trained subjects, and that is a huge issue. Is that there's actually very little research that's been carried out in trained subjects. My dissertation study that I mentioned earlier is being carried out in subjects that have an average of 4 years training experience, and it's going to provide really groundbreaking research in this area. But we need really research in all the areas of the training variables, volume, loading, rest intervals, speed of repetitions, all of these factors we need to qualify for what is optimal to maximize a hypertrophic response, and specifically in trained individuals.
Excellent.
Great. We'll wrap that up now and just talk about the seminars in Bath and London, Luke. So
So Brad's coming over to London on January the 24th, and he'll be doing the talk at Bath University. And then on the 25th of January, you're going to be all the way back down in London, also doing another talk. So Brad, if you could maybe give us a bit of, in starting off with the Bath University talk, what it's going to be on, because it's going to be short but very informative. So if you could give us a bit of information on that, please.
First of all, I'm really pumped about coming to England. It's a place I've always wanted to visit and never have. And I've gotten so many requests over the years, people asking me, when are you going to come to England, UK, and give a seminar. So it's really great. And I know that there's a lot of people from neighboring countries, too, the way Europe is, as opposed to America, where basically you do something here and you get mostly Americans. You get people from all over, and people from Spain and Ireland and just all sorts of other countries. I think Italy are going to be coming. But yeah, the Bath topic is going to be on low load training and blood flow restriction. I'm really going to get into the science behind it as well as the art. So we touched on this today, but I'm going to talk about how you can really what we know, and then from there, how can we utilize this to optimize a hypertrophy program, to integrate these factors into a hypertrophy program. And that'll be a shorter topic. I think it's a 2-hour seminar, which should be very cool. And then the London seminar is really going to be the full-blown, full-day seminar where I'm going to get into all aspects, basically soup to nuts. So I'll talk about, number one, all the aspects of the mechanisms of hypertrophy, the science by what promotes muscle hypertrophy, and then get into the practical application. So how do we periodize this, put that into a routine? How do we manipulate the variables? How do we customize it for the individual? And also then talk about the nutritional end, which I'm really big upon. And we'll get into things like creating a customized, individualized nutritional prescription, as well as things like nutrient timing, protein timing, which I have a bunch of papers, one of them with your buddy Alan Aragon, my buddy Alan Aragon, who I know is doing a seminar later this month there, and is really a great friend of mine, and just a great scientist, just one of the tops.
Excellent.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, looking forward to
Me too.
to both events. Yeah, so thanks very much for your time, Brad. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So yeah, looking forward to you coming over to England. So
Dropping
thanks
some
again.
knowledge. And what we'll do is we'll put your links to the seminars, but also to your website as well, Brad, so people can look at the great blogs and content you've got on there as well.
Terrific.
Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Cheers, guys.
No worries.
Thank you. Bye.
Switch the